Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 8. We're going to talk about trustworthiness, writing your strengths and limitations section, and using a theoretical framework. So you're reading Merriam, and you should be doing some writing and thinking about what's in Merriam. That reading is absolutely essential for writing your section on trustworthiness, or you might call it strengths and limitations. It's amazing how Merriam lays out all the different ways we can argue that qualitative research has validity and reliability. So the purpose of qualitative research, and I know some of you have some surveys and quantitative, we'll talk about that briefly as well, but almost all of you have some kind of qualitative research. And the purpose is understanding and phenomena and experiences in context. So a rich, deep understanding of a contextualized situation. And that really affords us something really important, especially in regards to social justice. It elevates the voices of our participants. It gives a sense of the whole picture. So students and other people are not boiled down to things like test scores. It contextualizes what we understand. We can study systems a little bit easier through qualitative research. So it's very important. Now, in the Merriam chapter, there's a quote by Guba and Lincoln, who are very famous, longtime qualitative methodologists. And they say that in qualitative research, we want to still understand how that research represents the lived experience of people, right? So we want to know that it's not just made up. We want to know that this isn't just something someone plucked out of thin air, right? There is a need to establish trustworthiness. We want to know, were the interviews reliably and validly constructed? Was the content properly analyzed? Do the conclusions rest on data and evidence? So is there evidence for what is being claimed? I think is really the question at hand. And Merriam then breaks this down into 3 areas. Internal validity, which means how closely does your study represent the lived experiences or the perspectives or perceptions of the people you're studying? Reliability, which is, in quantitative research, it means that you can repeat it and you'll get the same thing. But in this case, in qualitative research, it often means, can we understand exactly what you did to get where you are? And external validity or generalizability, which is, hey, does this matter to anywhere other than the context you're studying? So those are the 3 questions being asked. Now, Merriam brings up a few ways that qualitative researchers can say, hey, we have this, I have constructed my study so that you can be assured, right? So for internal validity, for really accurately representing as closely as possible, depending on the theory and positionality of the researcher, accurately representing the voices and experiences of participants, there are things like member checks, where you go and you check with the people that you're doing research and say, hey, does this make sense to you? Also triangulation. So triangulation across multiple people, like doing multiple interviews, or triangulation across different data sources. Like a lot of times you might do interviews, but if you do observations also, that's a really great way to triangulate. Like if you do interviews about the relationships between administrators and teachers, and then you do an observation of one of their meetings, right? You can really see, okay, is what they're saying, like to what degree is what they're saying reflected in this observation? And you might find that one or the other group is actually, or one or the other persons is actually representing that reality more closely than the other. Or maybe they just each have different perspectives of what you see in the observation. Reliability. So one thing Merriam talks about, I want to bring to the fore, is what's called an audit trail. That's what I'm trying to help you do in your methods, which is a very detailed account of what actually happens, of how you came up with your interview questions, of why you're asking those questions, of where you ask those questions, who you asked them to, why did you choose those people? That's an audit trail. And a lot of detail helps people be assured of the accuracy of representation of what they're reading. Then there's external validity or generalizability. And this is something you'll hear people a lot of times say, well, if it's not quantitative, I mean, you're just studying this one little place, it doesn't mean anything, right? Like, oh, you just talked to one person, that doesn't mean anything. And so Miriam goes through a lot of really great arguments around how qualitative research contributes to the larger picture, right? One of the ones I want to call out is naturalistic generalizability, which is the idea that when people read your study, maybe it's done at CSU East Bay, or maybe it's done at a particular school, but they read, oh, here's the types of students East Bay serves, here's the situation that they're trying to address, here are the experiences of the African American students at East Bay, and then they read about the study. They might read the findings regarding, for example, the voices of African American males and their experiences at East Bay, and they might think, oh, this actually does make a lot of sense in my context, or I've seen something very similar in my context. So it generalizes in terms of the reader seeing where there's similarities. There's also generalizability up to theory. Like, that's how we build theory, is doing these kinds of qualitative research. The other way you can ensure some kinds of external validity is through the way you sample. For example, some people argue that having multiple cases that you examine instead of just one case can help you to compare, oh, well, if it's like this in this context, but it's different in this context, we get a little bit more of an understanding of what it might be like across contexts. You also want to be very clear about who you're sampling and why, because if you want it to be, for example, a representative sample, you might choose one group of people, but if you want to maybe represent different ends of a continuum, it might be another group of people. Or maybe you want to get a nice variety across a group, sampling male and female students at different levels of their education. So those are some different ways that you can be thinking about trustworthiness in your qualitative research. To reiterate a little bit, one of what Miriam is trying to say in many qualitative research is that there are many interpretations of reality, and yours is just one, but you want that interpretation to be sound, and you want people to understand how you arrived at that interpretation so they can see the process. And so here we're talking about discussing the process by which you have arrived at your conclusion. So that's your analysis process. Having multiple sources or types of evidence, we talked about that already, triangulation. Surfacing your positionality, so that's something that we've talked about already. Writing your positionality section so people know where you're coming from. Checking your findings with a participant, that's member checking, but you can also check with a colleague, and then we already talked about comparing across 2 or more cases. Now with quantitative, usually you would have a strengths and limitations section rather than a trustworthiness section. Here you really need to establish the validity of the instrument. So in quantitative, you have an instrument in between you and the participant. In qualitative, usually you, the researcher, are the instrument, right? You are asking the questions. Yes, you have an interview instrument, but you're asking the questions in person. But in quantitative, in many cases, right, it's a survey they're taking online or something like that, and you want to ensure some sort of validity of the instruments. So with this, you want to go back to our class last semester and look up the slides, look up some of the readings, and think about the survey construction process, where you get the questions, how you go through a process of creating and ensuring the questions are going to get the data you want, and going through a process to establish face validity, which would be something like having participants read the survey and let you know what they think. So if you're surveying administrators, for example, you should find an administrator, have them look through the survey, have them give you very detailed feedback. Does this word make sense? Is there any double-barreled questions? Is there any way in which this survey doesn't make sense? Content validity, where you're reading the literature closely, you're deciding on very particular constructs, and you are trying to map your survey very closely onto those constructs. And of course, the other forms of validity that we talked about last semester. And finally, the reliability of the instrument, which can be established through a variety of means, the easiest of which is to test whether each set of questions that you think are measuring one construct are in fact cohesive. And you do that through what's called a Cronbach's alpha. So there's ways to test this numerically, these things numerically, and there are ways to test these things through doing interviews and things like that. If you are doing a survey, this is something that we should talk a little bit more about. All right, I'm going to give you two examples of trustworthiness. One, they're going to be kind of on two ends of the spectrum. So the one I'm going to show you right now is kind of a nascent one. It's still good, but it's very nascent. It's kind of like the bare bones of what might go in the pilot study. The one I'm going to show you after that is Heather, my student Heather. It's what she has in her dissertation, right? So this is kind of what you're aiming towards. Now, I don't expect you to have that right this second, but it's a great map. You know, you could really map what you're doing onto what Heather has done, or be thinking about it as you write yours. Now, please do not copy and paste Heather's into your methods. You need to, write it yourself. So in this example, Domina wrote, the steps are, I will perform a validity check by asking participants to confirm my findings. So that's that member check. And she might want to cite Miriam here, right? Like this is a good place where you can cite someone. I will record notes and transcribe shortly after to get all the data in while it is fresh in my mind. So this is an audit trail, like her sort of saying, here's how I'm going to collect and treat my data so that it has more depth and richness. I will review my findings with a colleague. So again, this is establishing that validity around making sure that the way I'm interpreting the findings is not too far out there. And then I will triangulate the findings by comparing the results among 3 interviewees. So triangulation is a really great word to use, right? That you're getting multiple perspectives. Okay, I am now going to switch over to Heather's. You can see something, now kind of this is as it's built out what it might look like, all right? So in her limitations section, she says, there are a number of limitations that may impact the data in the study. So then here you can see that she's listed her 3: transparency, commitment, positional power, and sample size, all right? Now what I put in red is the issue, the limitation, and then the green is the strength, or what she does about that. And this is something to think about in either your trustworthiness or your strength and limitation section, is that you want to list the limitations, the problems. For example, we know qualitative research is never really generalizable, but then you want to talk a little bit about what it does do, what's so important, right? So you might argue that it's not generalizable, but it does provide this deep contextualized view of someone's lived experience, all right? So in terms of transparency, she says, while collecting data through surveys, interviews, and observations, participants may not have contributed their honest thoughts and feelings. And several of you have brought this up as something you're a little worried about in terms of limitations. But here's what she says that she's going to do, or that she thinks ameliorates it to some degree, right? Like our things that we do don't entirely make up for it, but they ameliorate it somewhat. She says, using information from multiple sources is a way to triangulate data and overcome issues of transparency. Data collected from the survey were used to support individual interviews and observations. So she's saying, yeah, someone could not be honest, but if I collect survey data, interviews, and observations, we could maybe get down to the root of things, all right? Now, willingness, somewhat similar. Participants' willingness and commitment to providing information may be a limitation. And then, of course, this is after she's done it. She says, hey, everyone agreed to participate in the survey. And everyone who was asked to participate in an interview agreed. So most people were willing, right? You can think that before she did her study, maybe she just had this part, right? That, hey, I'm a little worried that people may not be willing, all right? Now, positionality. In this case, she was an administrator in this group of schools. So she says, because I'm a member of the organizations, participants may feel obliged to answer questions neutrally to avoid conflicts or judgments. And what she's doing about it is she is having them, or she's showing them that there's non-disclosure, that, of course, from the IRB, that what she collects will not go back to the organization and that it will be anonymous, right? Now, this is a really important part of a qualitative study, particularly. She says, look, the sample size is not that big, right? This is one charter school organization, all right? But she chose to utilize participants from all 4 schools in the charter organization, right? That gives her a little bit larger of a pool, and really it gives her a comparative case study, all right? But she says, hey, this still is going to be a small sample size, and this is really important. She says it could yield limitations around generalizability. In other words, we can't say, hey, this generalizes to everybody. Like, what I find means, all charter schools are going through exactly the same thing. It's a very specific group of students, right, which doesn't represent the population as a whole. And also charter schools are a unique context, okay? So she says, yet, although it doesn't represent all educational systems, the knowledge learned from the study can be transferred to other similar settings, perhaps, right? And then notice she has a citation. Now, I do wish that she had citations throughout, right? As you're reading the Merriam chapter, that's a great chapter to cite as you write, kind of make your justifications throughout. Now, survey validity is a very particular thing, and I want to point this out, and especially for those of you who are doing surveys. So she said, first, I established content validity by reviewing the literature to understand and define the most important constructs and relationships. So this is a good way to argue that you have some content validity, and I would have a citation here. Secondly, I searched and reviewed other published surveys, and I used questions from those surveys. So that's saying, hey, they established validity in a certain way, and I use questions from those surveys. Then she had teachers and administrators review the survey. So this is face validity. All right, so she had them look at the wording and things like that. Now, she goes back and says, you know what, the sample size may still be a problem. But she kind of summarizes the strengths. I have triangulation, I've got a mixed methods design, and I have a particular positionality that I'm going to let you know what it is. All right, so you can see how really the argument around strengths and limitations and trustworthiness can be really robust and can refer to a lot of the different things that you see in the chapter on Merriam. Okay, so now, before the end of this video, I would like to go over how a theory is used to analyze data. All right. So we've looked over an article where different kinds of theories were used to analyze one piece of data. I'm going to take the sense-making piece of that article and really go through it in depth using colors to show how the theory is used to analyze data, all right? So here is the write-up of the theory. And you can also really learn something about how to write up theory from this, okay? So this is a fairly short theoretical framework also. Like, you would need at least something like this in your qualifying exam too. So this first part here, this is the sense-making theory part, which is the part I wrote. This first part just gives kind of a general overview, almost like a history of it, right? Reform implementation scholars have taken up the lens of sense-making. This is kind of what's going on. This is where it's from. It came out of organizational theory, right? Then there's a definition. This study draws on a functional view of sense-making, defining it as, right? So very specific, a process by which educators, when encountering new standards, look at the local environment and each other for cues to construct understanding of future action. And of course, a citation, all right? Then I unpack that definition a little bit. That's what all this orange stuff is. In the application of the theory, sense-making is a process of co-constructing meaning that takes place around dialogue between group members. So it's interesting, how does this definition happen? Well, people are talking, they're co-constructing meaning. This creates opportunities for group members to integrate and respond to the messages. And then pushing it even further, and almost all theories have sort of sub-theories, you might have noticed it. And in this case, one of the sub-theories is, well, where are those messages from? Externally, organizationally, interpersonally, or intrapersonally, all right? So I'm taking from these authors to list particular where the messages can be from. Now, I also may highlight messages where the messages are from that show up in my data. So maybe the messages can originate externally from 8 different places, but I only am going to talk about 3 places because those are the 3 places that show up in my findings. All right. So you are honing your theoretical framework and taking the pieces that show up in your findings. Now, of course, you don't know what your findings are yet. So in your case, you want to just kind of write about all 8 and see what happens. All right. Now, I've got 3 other areas of sense-making theory I want to talk about. And these, again, are these kinds of sub-areas of the theory. So I've already, I've defined the theory as a whole up here, but that's not enough. I want to talk about some of the kind of nuts and bolts about how does the theory claim people act, right? Like what is it saying makes a difference? So one of the things is ambiguity and uncertainty, that it's not just, okay, people make sense of things. Okay, fine. But it's saying, hey, people tend to do more sense making when there's a source of ambiguity or uncertainty, right? Like otherwise people might just go through their routines. So then I define what those sources of ambiguity can be. And again, I focus on things that are going to be showing up in my research: goals, lack of clarity in roles, and limited resources. Then another piece is, well, what do people think about when they do sense making? What are the resources they draw on? So I have another little mini section about those resources and what those areas of resources are. One area consists of knowledge, prior knowledge in the area of ambiguity and uncertainty. The second area is formal authority can be a resource. And finally, artifacts or materials can be a resource. So I call attention to 3 or 4 different resources, again, that are something that's related to my research question and data. And then finally, I want to call attention to actions that then people act based on their sense making. Okay, so note the colors because these are going to show up later. So main definition, people talking to one another to make sense of something, is in red or orange. Ambiguity or uncertainty is in green. Resources is in blue, and action is in purple. Okay. Now, briefly, because those are going to show up later, I want to talk about just the analysis here. So you're going to be writing your analysis paragraph. That I talk a little bit about how I delineate the data into like certain processes, how I delineate the start and end of each process, and then how I assigned codes pertaining to the source of ambiguity and the resources, right? So again, I'm already referring to the theory that I assigned codes. The codes I assigned in my analysis were related to the sources of ambiguity and the resources, 2 areas of the theory. Okay, now notice the green, right? Already I'm using that theory in my results or my findings, all right? So I went through all the data, I coded, I looked for sources of ambiguity and uncertainty, and I say the main sources of ambiguity and uncertainty in this dialogue that I was coding fell along 3 continuums that existed in a state of overlap: interpretation and implementation of the next generation science standards, intersection with other state policies, and district cultural and organizational context. So I organize them this way, right? This is how the process of analysis sort of boils the data down based on your particular theory, right? So I have a specific framework in mind, and as I reduce the data, I'm putting the data into these pieces that have to do with that framework. So then I go on, of course, to unpack each of those sources of ambiguity and uncertainty using a figure. I really like figures. Now, in the next research question, I'm asking about resources. So now you can see that blue text, that connection. In the process of discussing or making sense of ambiguity and uncertainty, educators drew on various resources, sources of knowledge and authority. And then I give categories, right? So I'm looking at resources and I'm putting the data into categories. One was the expertise of teachers at the table. And then I talk a little bit about teachers contributed several areas of knowledge. This is a resource. A key area was knowledge of science content and classroom practices. They also brought knowledge regarding other teachers' needs and frustrations. Okay, and then I talk all about that and provide evidence. Then another resource was administrator expertise, right? And finally, external expertise, etc. Now, notice that there's pieces of the original definition coming in. So for example, I talk about the TOSA playing a bridging role. He was familiar with the work of teachers, the role of administrators, and the shifting goals of state science education policy. So he played kind of an overarching role in supporting and facilitating the sense-making of everyone at the table, all right? I also talk about kind of overall what's going on. The prevalence of multiple sources of knowledge implies that problem-solving processes may have turned out differently without all the stakeholders. Teachers, administrators, external facilitators, and the presence of other districts all provided key pieces of information in the process of making sense of ambiguous conditions. All right, so resulting at times in problem solving. So if we think about that action piece, right, like sense making is bringing in information to make sense of sources of ambiguity within a social context. I'm kind of saying, hey, that's what's going on here. And sometimes it resulted in action and not always. All right, now I want to move into the discussion, which you are going to be writing for your pilot study and of course your dissertation, and show you how the theory makes its way into the discussion also. All right, so here you see again the ambiguity. This study demonstrates that successful transitions in highly ambiguous contexts can be facilitated by opportunities for sense making, including meetings such as highlighted in this data. So it's kind of an overarching comment, right? That like, hey, that opportunities for sense making are really important to handle ambiguity. All right. Now, something, associated with the overall definition is that the results indicate that supporting district reforms require having the right people at the table consistently over time. So bring the right people into the sense-making context, right? And finally, something with resources, each role brought pivotal knowledge to the table. Teachers brought their understanding of how to support teachers. The admins brought administrative authority and bureaucratic knowledge, and the TOSA and the external facilitators, all right? So you can see that I'm bringing the theory into the discussion as well. Okay, hopefully this process of walking through this helps you understand a little bit better how you are applying your theory. You're looking through your theory like glasses to see the data, right? To see, okay, I see those resources. I see those sources of ambiguity, and then you're placing them into categories. All right, I am going to end the recording here. I look forward to seeing you soon.